Good afternoon to all. Boa tarde a todas e todos. Bem-vindos. Welcome to the discussion on pandemic Brazil, economic and political upheaval in times of COVID-19. My name is Thomas Fujiwara. I'm a professor at the economics department at Princeton University and the associate director of the Brazil lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, which is hosting the event. So our conversation today is hosted in partnership with the Graduate Program in Social Anthropology at the Museu Nacional, the Department of Preventive Medicine of the University of São Paulo, and the Institute for Health Policy Study, IEPS, all of them in Brazil. And we also like to thank our on-campus partners and sponsors here in Princeton, the Program in Latin American Studies, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Department of Anthropology. So for a very quick introduction, let me just say that, as most of our viewers know, it has been 6 months since Brazil confirmed its first death by COVID-19. In this period, the country has entered a crisis both in its health fronts and the economic front and the political front, with few, if any, historical precedents. So just as of this morning, Brazil had confirmed 4.2 million cases and almost 130,000 deaths by COVID-19. And these statistics even have to be taken with caution given limited testing and underreporting. Brazil's death toll is only surpassed by the United States, right, in the whole world. And essentially every part of the country, from its urban centers to its native communities in the Amazon forest, have been hardly hit by the virus. On the economic front, Brazilian GDP, which already had a poor performance before the pandemic, fell by 11% in the last quarter, and as a comparison to the same quarter the year before, 2019, which is the largest drop ever recorded in the Brazilian GDP series. And the political upheaval in the country is also very worrisome, right? Including multiple questions on institutional degradation and democratic backsliding. So to help us make sense of this crisis and this kind of complicated situation the country is going through, we have with us today two women who have been at the forefront of the public debate surrounding the pandemic in Brazil. First, Mônica de Bolle is an economist and a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. She's the author of numerous books, including the forthcoming, it's coming soon, Pilha de Areia, Ruptura. She has a very popular YouTube channel and writes for major Brazilian newspapers such as Folha de São Paulo, Estadão, and the magazine Época. Second, Malu Gaspar is an investigative journalist and author. She works at Revista Piauí, a magazine in Brazil, and is currently writing a book on Odebrecht, the giant engineering company at the center of numerous corruption scandals throughout Latin America. She hosts the also very popular Foro de Teresina, a podcast on Brazilian politics. So it is a great pleasure to have them participating in this online discussion. We look forward to their insights as we try to make some sense of these turbulent times. To get our conversation started, I'll ask one question to each of them, to each of you, Mônica and Malu, and then I'll let Malu and Mônica engage with each other on issues that they deem relevant to the conversation. I should also say that we are also collecting questions and comments from the YouTube channel chat. So you viewers at home can also send us questions, and we'll try to kind of go through them and pick some of them to pass along to Mônica and Malu. So let me start asking a question to Mônica to help us and help the viewers at home by giving a brief overview of the economic situation in Brazil. As I mentioned earlier, the economic and health statistics are kind of incredibly dire. But I wanted to give a kind of brief summary of the economic outlook and the pandemic kind of situation, the government response so far, and what directions she sees the Brazilian economy going forward as we move along. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And my deepest thanks to the Brazil Lab. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and speaking here. And I would also like to say good afternoon to Malu. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with you. So I'm very happy. I listen to your podcast. I'm a fan. So it's very nice. So the question of where we were, where we are, and where are we going, which I guess summarizes a bit what Thomas was asking. So coming into the pandemic, as Thomas was saying in his opening remarks, Brazil was already in a somewhat difficult situation. So the country had a very deep recession in 2015 and 2016, had staged a recovery in 2017. There were hopes that this recovery would pick up in that year, specifically 2017, and then later in 2018, 2019. These hopes were dashed year after year because the economy never really took off. So in those 3 years that followed the recession, 2017 to 2019, Brazil had average growth rates of about 1% per year, which was very low. And the unemployment rate was still high. Inflation, nonetheless, came down. It was very high during the recession of 2015, 2016 for several reasons, and it came down substantially over these last 3 years. So going into the pandemic, Brazil was really in this sort of fragile situation. The economy was not doing very well, unemployment was high. There were hopes for reforms, but these were all sort of medium to long-term reforms, none of which were going to have any impact, short-term impact on growth. And so, that was the situation coming into the pandemic. As we have seen in other countries, what's happened in Brazil since the pandemic struck the country is that GDP has fallen massively. So as Thomas was saying, a dramatic drop in GDP in the second quarter. But before that, in the first quarter of the year, GDP had contracted also by a large amount. So in the first half of the year, the first half of 2020 has really been the most disastrous if we look at just the time series of national accounts for Brazil. In the second quarter, with the exception of agriculture, both on the supply side as well as on the demand side, the figures were all historically bad. So the situation really is very complicated. But again, this is the type of thing that we've seen in other countries. The bigger problem that I see is how will Brazil actually get out of this? Because while in some countries we can see, for example, if we think of countries that were hit by the pandemic, but were able to control the health situation through public health measures sort of early on, and then were able to open their economies. And here I'm not thinking of developed economies, I'm thinking of emerging markets that were able to do that, specifically Asian countries. Their prospects are obviously better because the economic situation is completely intertwined with the public health situation. In Brazil, on the other hand, the situation is still, the pandemic is still out of control. The measures that were tried or that were attempted by governors, the state, the government, the actual federal government never really had a clear policy or a clear strategy. In fact, the president undermined governors' efforts to contain the epidemic via lockdowns and quarantines and things like that from the get-go, so from the outset. And what we've seen is that Brazil never really put in place stringent lockdown measures or anything of that sort that we saw other countries do. So in the end, it has kind of come down to the worst of all worlds, because there is an out of control epidemic still brewing in the country. Even if the numbers have been looking somewhat better in the last few days, the overall picture is still very bad, and the virus is still circulating. So there's always the possibility that we will see waves of this, and bursts and surges of these numbers, which, as Thomas has highlighted, are underreported in some sense. We don't know exactly the extent. We can look at it state by state, but on a federal level, we don't have very much of a sense of how big the underreporting might be, but there is underreporting. And the fact that the epidemic has been uncontrolled has affected the economy, and it has affected the economy in many different ways. One of the ways by which it has really hit the economy is that it's left a lot of people. Brazil is a country with a very vulnerable population. I think the last event that we had that I participated at the Brazil Lab, we talked about, things like basic income programs and all of that, and how that applies to a situation like that of Brazil's during the pandemic. And Brazil was really a candidate for something like that, at least for an emergency basic income program, because of the sheer size of the vulnerable population. And when we say vulnerable, we're talking about people who work in the informal sector or people who are self-employed, but we can't understand self-employment in Brazil in the same way that we understand self-employment in the US. So self-employed in Brazil are really day workers. These are people who rely on a daily income to basically bring food to the table. And these were, of course, the people who were hardest hit by the epidemic from early on, and are still being very hard hit by the epidemic. And so one of the things that Brazil did, which was actually quite successful, even though it has had a lot of implementation problems at the outset, was this emergency basic income program, which served to at least give support to this population, and in some sense give support to the economy as well. I mean, it doesn't appear in the aggregate numbers, but when you look at sort of municipal level data and these more granular data, you can see how giving a cash transfer, and it was actually a sizable cash transfer to this portion of the population that received it, and it was actually ended up being a very large portion of the population. Nearly half of the Brazilian population had in the end access to the emergency basic income program. That has helped some municipalities to at least remain more or less okay on the financial front. A lot of these municipalities were facing financial problems before the pandemic. And the fact that, these cash transfers began helped, not increase, but at least it allowed for the fall that we saw in tax collections in some places not to fall by that much. So that gave some support to municipalities, which was essential because, of course, if they had not had that support indirectly, a lot of essential services would have stopped. So things like, trash collections and basic security, policing in the streets and stuff, and things of that sort would have disappeared because the financial problems that these municipalities were facing preceded the pandemic. So that's sort of where we are in terms of policies. The one that really worked was this emergency basic income program. Other than that, the government hasn't really had a concerted strategy to deal with the pandemic, neither on the public health front nor on the economy. So one thing that we have seen happen in Brazil, and it's been very dramatic, is that in the small and medium sized firm sector, so for SMEs in Brazil, we have seen a lot of SMEs going bankrupt and thus firing a lot of people. And these bankruptcies and the way that they have been happening means that these are companies that are unlikely to become viable again once there is some sense of normalcy coming back to the country. So the government has really failed in its ability to provide, some kind of small business program to sustain these companies. So nothing like the US has done for small businesses, or even European countries have done for small businesses, was done in Brazil. And that's been a problem because these are companies that employ a lot of people, and these are companies that by and large are very, very present in the services sector and in commerce. And so so retail. So we have seen, a lot of job losses in those two sectors, and a lot of people who have, as a result, dropped out of the labor force because they have stopped looking for jobs. And so that the labor market situation, coupled with, the SME situation, has really been very dramatic. So that's where we are. The government, the central bank, has done a lot, has used a lot of policies to sustain the financial sector and prevent any sort of financial problems from erupting. It's been successful at doing that. But, in terms of, as I said, in terms of a concerted strategy, there really hasn't been one. And as for the future, and I know I'm probably over time, so I'll be very brief in these remarks, and then we can come back to them in the Q&A. But as for the future, the situation is also not very good because the government also doesn't have a strategy going forward. So it has no strategy apart from betting on a vaccine coming into the market rather quickly. So the last few remarks that we've seen from the economy minister in Brazil are all in the line of saying, oh, Brazil will have a strong recovery in 2021 because by then we'll have a vaccine. And as we have seen with the latest, what's been happening in some phase 3 trials, specifically the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine trial, these phase 3 trials are complicated. They may be paused for different reasons. They may be suspended for different reasons. It's normal that happens, but what that tells us is that this kind of bet on a vaccine coming to the market very soon, and that will save the economy and that will save everything, this is not a reasonable sort of approach for a government to take. A government needs to have a more conservative approach, and therefore an approach that actually sustains the economy going forward, not betting on the best outcome, but having something that's more realistic. So that's been the problem all along. And with that, I'll leave it here, and I'm happy then to interact with Malu and then take questions from those who are watching us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. It was a great overview for me and the viewers at home. So now, let me now ask Malu kind of pretty similar question, but like instead of more focus on economics, more focus on the political consequences of the pandemic in Brazil. So as I mentioned very briefly earlier, like even for Brazilian standards, the last months have been very turbulent, right? In addition to the pandemic, President Bolsonaro has been involved in corruption scandals. His relationship with the courts, with the judiciary, and with Congress has been complicated. It oscillates like weekly or daily between temporary alliances and threats of kind of coup d'etat style interventions, which are kind of incredibly worrisome because Brazil still is a young democracy. We've been here for like 30, 35 years only. And so I will ask Malu to kind of give us, our viewers, a brief summary of the political situation. Right? Where do you see the next 2 years on Bolsonaro's term going? He still has 2 more years until the beginning of 2023, and he's as we all know, running for re-election too. And at this point, it seems that everything is sort of on the table. It's possible we'll see an impeachment. It's possible we'll see him get re-elected. It's possible he'll actually stage a coup or some intervention that kind of provides democratic backsliding and put Brazil in it consolidates his power through like less democratic means. So all those things seem real possibilities. Like ask Malu, where does she see the country going from here? Thank you.
Well, easy question. Easy questions, only easy questions. So, well, first of all, it's a great pleasure being with you. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with you, Monica, Tomás, and Miquel. And before starting, I would ask you to pardon my English because it's nowhere near as good as yours, but I'll try to do my best here, okay? So people, pardon. But, well, for the turbulent times, it's been like riding inside a roller coaster, wearing a mask, a pilotless roller coaster, wearing a mask. So it's difficult to summarize what we've been through, but I think everybody more or less know what we've been seeing in the noticiary, like in the news. So precisely because of this, I would like to start by the end. I think Monica summarized very well the situation we are seeing here in Brazil, but this is the most astonishing thing. Despite of all this situation she described, we are seeing a president who went through the biggest pandemic in our history with a negationist stance, and despite of all that, he's got to this point of the crisis politically stronger than before. So this is really astonishing for normal people, right? Yeah. When the pandemic started, a lot of analysts thought that Bolsonaro would be wiped out, either by the economic effects of the pandemic or by the large number of deaths that we would see. And actually, we are seeing. But 6 months later, what we see is that the president's popularity is more or less in the level it was before the pandemic starts. And depending on the poll, it's even higher. So We saw Bolsonaro say that COVID-19 was a little flu, then to take part on demonstrations, shake hands with hundreds of people, boycotting the social distancing, insisting in the adoption of the hydroxychloroquine as a main official treatment for coronavirus. In the process, he fired 2 health ministers and a justice minister, Sérgio Moro, who most of people suppose it was crucial for his political survival. And I didn't even begin talking about the institutional disassembling effort he's been doing. So, but I agree with Monica when she says that he didn't manage a health crisis, that Bolsonaro didn't manage a health crisis, strictly speaking, because he didn't take this as a health crisis. He dealt with the whole situation as if it wasn't a health problem. So he looked at the crisis and he did what he does best. He started to create more crises, producing factoids and smoke screens, while simply denying we even had a health problem going on. And this is his environment, right? He works on chaos. He is the chaos guy. And adding to that, we had this tactic he used to oppose economics to health. And he chose to bet on the economic side of the crisis, hitchhiking an opposition proposal, which was the emergence basic income, and worked to get credit for it. He got the credit for it, and this gave him some space to breathe. So I think now we should look at what everybody's paying attention now is on how he's going to manage the new situation, since we're going to have this basic income cut by half for the next month. And also we're seeing this, the prices of basic items like rice and beans, which is the basic Brazilian diet, is going high. So this can harm him politically. So, but the only fact that we are discussing this by now, and not, as Monica said, vaccines, strategies to put kids back to school, for example, a lot of different and very, very important issues. I think this shows that he won this narrative war. For him, there's no pandemic anymore. So it's a very weird thing and very sad thing to see, but that's the truth. So I don't think we should underestimate Bolsonaro's ability to overcome crisis, creating more crisis. This is obviously very bad for us. It's very dangerous for our democracy. Just to give a little hint of what we can talk about later, we've seen he worked very hard to dismantle the whole institutional framework we know from environmental structure, operational in the government, to the anti-corruption framework, because this is the best way for him to manage the whole situation. And then he did the alliances with the physiological congressmen. There's this very big group of congressmen called, in Portuguese, I don't know how to translate it, Centrão, would be big center, I don't know, but whatever. It's a big group of congressmen that basically sell their support for money and for positions in the government, that are highly interested in dismantling this institutional framework. So what I think we can see from now on is that, this is not a forecasting, because I'm not in the forecasting business, I'm only a reporter, but I can tell you from what I hear in the government, in the Congress, and also from investors that are being engaged by the government, lots of background conversations, that Bolsonaro is willing to do anything that is possible to keep this support in the second half of his term. And this is not it's a very important variable. I don't know if I can say that. It's a very important element for us to evaluate anything that we can, that we need to evaluate from now on. For example, is Bolsonaro going to spend more that he can to keep this program going on? Yes, he is. If the Congress let him spend, if the economic minister let him spend, he will spend, because he doesn't care about institutional frames, about limits, about anything. And he's the most perfect given populist governor. So I think we should work with this in mind and try to figure out how to contribute to public debate, having this in our horizon. I don't think we should neither underestimate Bolsonaro's ability to thrive in the chaos, and I think we could count on this fiscal chaos. I don't know if you can say that. If he can, he will do that. That's it.
Thank you. This is, I guess, thank you, Malu. No, this is fantastic. Yeah, it kind of gives a kind of a great overview.
I don't know how many times I use it, but
no, it was perfect. Yes. So actually, I'll let you guys, if you have reactions or questions from like what each other said, and
I have a reaction to what Malu said, which I completely agree with. So she said, very, very with no uncertain terms, that Bolsonaro has won the narrative, and I think she's absolutely right. I mean, when we look at the situation in Brazil, you read out the COVID numbers. They're awful. We have over 4 million cases. We have over 130,000 deaths. These are still on the rise. We're still having a number of cases per day, thousands of cases per day. We're still having, in the 7-day moving average on the death rate is still very high. Nonetheless, this has taken sort of a backseat to other issues that have arisen. And the types of discussions that we have seen around these other issues have been very polarizing and very divisive. And it does seem like, he's in control. If one can look at a paradoxical situation and say something, I would say Bolsonaro is in control of the chaos, because, he creates the chaos. So he's in control of the chaos. And I think the chaotic discussions that are happening in Brazil right now with respect to the rise in staple products, so staple foods like rice, beans, oil, cooking oil, all of these other items that have seen quite significant price increases over the last few months, but that have really bumped up over the last month. And the way that the country is divided in sort of talking about these issues tells us a lot about how he has been able to play with the chaos. So to give an example, this is a complex issue. To look at why food prices are rising, this is not easy. You have to look at a lot of different variables, and you have to analyze what is the impact of each. And we know that globally, food prices are on the rise. We see that. If we look at food price indexes, we see that food prices are rising globally. So that has repercussions for Brazil. We also know, and we've known this since the outset of the pandemic, that as a result of the pandemic, food prices would likely rise, at least for two reasons. One, uncertainty related to the pandemic, which does make people buy more staples. This is normal behavior. And second, the fact that we were going to see inevitably some countries restricting their own exports of food. So if we take rice, for example, which is one of the staples in the Brazilian diet, there are two countries in the world that are major producers of rice: Thailand and Vietnam. Both of those countries have imposed restrictions, not as recently, but relatively recently, on their exports. And so there's less rice to go around in global markets. Brazil buys rice from the rest of the world. It's not a rice producer. It produces some rice internally, but not enough to feed the entire population. So it's not self-sufficient in rice. So what's happened? Well, what's happened is that the increase in global prices of rice has affected rice prices internally in Brazil. You couple that with the devaluation of the exchange rate, and you get the result, at least part of the reason why you see the result that you see in supermarkets. Then you add to that the fact that, you know, this basic income program, this emergency basic income program is about to be cut in half, which does lead at least some people, you know, to worry if they're going to be able to buy these food staples going forward. So what do? If they still have a bit of a higher income than they're going to have down the road now, they will, of course, buy a little bit more now. So we have all those factors sort of playing together and sort of interacting to generate a situation that everybody feels in their pockets very, very deeply. And what's happening? Instead of people looking to the government for a solution and saying, oh, we're in this situation because, you know, the government has mismanaged the economic handling of the situation, the government has mismanaged the health crisis. So instead of putting the blame where the blame should be put, people are fighting between each other in terms of what are the reasons that are driving these increases in prices. And so if you put out a hypothesis and you say, okay, one of the reasons does have to do with, you know, the emergency basic income program being cut in half, and that's nothing to do with the people who are going to be buying more of these products. It's just, you know, basic human behavior, how these things happen. What you get is a lot of people fighting over these causes or these potential causes rather than actually thinking about what the government should be doing. And that, I think, is very telling. This is kind of anecdotal here, but I'm using it as an example to react to something that Malu said. To me, what this represents is a narrative that Bolsonaro has actually won. Bolsonaro has won the narrative that the pandemic is not that relevant, that, you know, yeah, it's still ongoing, but you know what? It's life as usual. The economy's open, if restaurants are open, schools are not open, of course, but everything else is. And so we should just live life as usual. And so people are, you know, reacting to these things, and they're reacting to these things not by blaming the government directly, but by blaming each other in a way.
The thing is that it's not useful to blame the government.
No,
it doesn't work.
No, exactly.
That's the problem. That's the trick. It's a trap because, for example, you're talking about the basic, the emergency basic income. He simply took the emergency basic income for him. It's his government program. So it's difficult to deal with that because nobody's going. He really created a trap because it's difficult for the opposition to defend something else than that. Yeah. And now we are seeing the opposition discuss as if, no, we need 600 reais forever, or no, we don't need. This is not a debate. It's not a worthful. It's not worthful. It's kind of waste of time.
Yeah, it's a waste. It's a waste.
Yeah, but in the other hand, there is no concrete and constructive stance from the opposition neither.
Yeah.
For example, you said you talked about the vaccination. I don't see people charging the government and asking for the government how to do that. It's a very complex effort to vaccinate 100 million people in Brazil. There are different kinds of vaccines, and you have different conditions on different cities, and this is going to be very complicated to implement. So we don't know when the vaccine is going to get here, but our government, our president just nominated for the main function in the government, the immunization director. I don't know if it's the right way to say, but he put a person that has no experience at all. So it's a vet that never worked with immunization. So I don't see. Look, I want to see the opposition What are they doing about that? Also, it's a very, very polarized issue here in Brazil. Putting kids back to school. It's a very complicated problem. All the time I talk about this here in Brazil in the podcast. People protest because they say I'm a medium class mother that wants their kids back to school. And I think it's very funny because what we see here is that schools are social protection equipment. We need to see to put kids back to school in some way. Of course, nobody's going to put kids back to school in risky conditions, but nobody's saying that either. But I don't see the opposition, the voices of the opposition discussing something really substantial. It's like, you can't go to school, you can't do that, you can't do that. But the reality is going to pass through us. It's difficult to tackle the debate, to deal with a so polarized debate, because substantial things are getting backwards. And I think this is the most difficult thing to deal with. And
I think in addition to that, Malu, which is I think a corollary of what you're saying, is that everything becomes ideological. Right? So if you're talking about the back to school debate, then it's not a rational conversation. It's a conversation where you have sides. So you have a side that, has an argument, and you have a side that has another argument. And because these sides will then be identified with different political leanings, there is no conversation. People just attack each other. That's what we've seen with the back to school debate in Brazil. And we have seen things which are actually complete nonsense, because we've seen, for example, some people saying, oh, I am not sending my kids back to school until there's a vaccine. Well, guess what? Kids are not going to get vaccinated first. That's just how it is.
And the vaccine is going to be available in 2021, in the end of the year.
Even if the vaccine, under this most optimistic scenario of all, where we have a vaccine by the end of the year, which some people in the government have been playing up. It's a completely sort of, it's not a realistic idea. But let's assume that scenario actually materializes. It's not the kids who are going to get vaccinated first.
They're probably going to be the last.
There's going to be a very limited amount of vaccines, depending even on what type of vaccine actually makes it in this horse race for the vaccine that we're seeing. Because there are at least a couple of vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, which are genetic vaccines. These are highly complex technologies. They're very difficult to store. Brazil doesn't have the storage capacity. You have to store these vaccines at minus 80 degrees Celsius. Brazil doesn't have the capacity to do this. It doesn't have the capacity to transport, these types of vaccines, which are extremely sensitive. So there are lots of issues here, with respect to how do we get back to normal when there is a vaccine, which people should be discussing and the government should be bringing to the table in terms of, okay, here's our strategy and here's what we're thinking of doing. But as you said, they have nobody who's competent or able to do this. And so the whole thing just morphs into this ideological debate about where you stand with respect to what, and therefore you're an extreme right person or you're an extreme left person. That's what it all boils down to in Brazil. It doesn't matter what issue you pick. It can be the vaccine. It can be an explanation for why food prices are rising. It can be, whatever. You're tagged as either an extreme leftist or an extreme right-wing person, and that's that. The debate ends, and we're not going to get anywhere like that. We're not.
That's exactly what Bolsonaro wants us to be. That's what we want.
We as a country won't get anywhere, but Bolsonaro will get to where he wants to be. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to take the control of the narrative when you don't have. You're not the incumbent. I understand this is difficult, but if you get into the trap, the guy puts for you, so it becomes more difficult.
Exactly.
It's kind of, you're getting into the trap. Why? Why is that? Why are you doing that? If education, health, they are progressive causes, they're leftist causes. I don't understand
Why don't we have proposals? Yeah.
Why people are not tackling that. Also about the debate on anti-corruption words here. Of course, we had, it's a very complicated issue. I don't know if we would have time to talk about that, but it's a trauma here in Brazil, the way that anti-corruption operations had developed. And people that, the critics had a lot of reason. But now that the government, the Brazilian government Bolsonaro is in the government, where we should work to improve the anti-corruption frame, the whole transparency, accountability, institutional frame, we're aligning to Bolsonaro to beat the institutional anti-corruption frame. I really don't understand this, because people go inside the trap he puts for his opponents. I don't understand. He really, and actually I understand in the sense that this polarized situation is good for some political forces. And then, and even in the left. So this put us all in this trap together with these political forces. I think it's very sad. I don't see a solution in the short term. The only solution is to be here, talking to you and trying to figure it out.
Yeah,
kind of.
I agree.
Yeah.
We agree. Okay.
Thank you. It was like a fantastic back and forth between you guys. Just like for the viewers, I hope we are checking at the questions. And actually, I think both Malu and Monica already answered some of the questions that were sent. I think both Aline and Lucas, for example, if you guys are listening, are sent questions on the food prices exactly. And also like on so actually, let me follow up a little bit on the food prices too. Do you actually see like there's kind of two things that I guess you guys already talked about this, that are coming that people can potentially think, oh, this will affect Bolsonaro's popularity. One is the food prices, right? Food staple prices are rising. And the other one is the emergency basic income, right? The 600 reais you guys mentioned, which is a temporary cash transfer scheme, right? That reaches more than half of Brazil, as Monica said. It's set to expire. It's going to be postponed but the amount will be cut by half. The amount each family will receive will be cut by half. So do you foresee, like Bolsonaro will also have another narrative for this, someone to blame for food prices, someone to blame for,
he's already blaming the supermarkets,
Yes.
So that one he's already saying, in a very, just to remind some of our viewers who may not know the entire history of Brazil, back in the 80s, when we had hyperinflation, we had a lot of stabilization plans that failed, all of them. And all of the plans that we had in the 80s involved some kind of price controls. And the very first plan that we had launched in 1986 was all about price controls. And there were these lists of prices that were posted at supermarkets, and they were also published in newspapers, and people would go to the stores, to the supermarkets with their lists, and they would be checking off, whether the supermarket was abusing prices or not, And Bolsonaro recently, not that he's bringing that type of situation back, but the way that he has been speaking about, supermarkets and potential price abuses and things like that is sort of reminiscent of what happened of this kind of behavior in the 80s. So he has already found a scapegoat for the food prices. It's supermarket and supermarket owners. They're the problem. It's them. They're creating the problem, and he's going to try to solve it. So for that, he's creating a narrative. Whether that's going to, later, if these food price rises persist, and they probably will, whether that's going to become some kind of, more concerted effort to control prices or not is to be seen. But I would say that, given his given that Bolsonaro is a clear populist, and I totally agree with Malu on this, and this is not a secret. We have known that Bolsonaro is a populist for decades. I mean, this is in his speeches, this is in everything that he says, and it's really very clear. And as a populist, I would not, throw out the window the possibility that if there's a persistence in food prices, he just might do what all populists do, which is to try to control prices. So that's a clear possibility. On the emergency basic income program, that will be interesting to see, because that one, since he didn't own it in the beginning, I mean, the emergency basic income program was an initiative of civil society with Congress. And, it was very quick. Congress was very quick in approving the emergency basic income program. The government had been against it up until sort of like the very last hour, until, it became a law. And afterwards, as Malu was saying, it just became the government's program because Bolsonaro realized that he got a lot of political gains out of it. And for that reason, now he owns the program. So given that he now owns the program, whatever happens to it, people will look to him. So this issue of reducing the benefit by half, which the government has announced, it's still not clear whether or not that is what's going to happen, because there are a number of bills in Congress that are trying to impede this from or block this from happening and maintain the benefit at 600 reais, which is its current value, until December, which is when when the benefit expires. It could happen that, because of and I think Malu can speak better about this than I can, but it could easily happen that if Bolsonaro starts to see a lot of pressure on him, there's already the food price pressure, and then this additional pressure, that he could very well say, okay, let's keep the 600 reais, and maybe he'll even extend it beyond December. Who knows? As I said, it's all within the populist playbook, and it's all within this mindset of.
But do you think we can afford this, Monica? Do you think we can afford?
No, we can't. We can't until we could, if we had set out a plan to say, okay, we're going to have an emergency basic income program at this level until December, and then we need to find some other way to support people, but it can't be this, because this is too expensive. It really is.
So you don't think we should keep the emergency basic income through 2021?
I don't think we can. I don't think we have the financial capacity to keep it. So what I think is we should transition to a basic income program.
That's what he's trying to do,
but a different kind of basic income program, one that actually fits, one that is actually compatible with the fiscal restrictions that the country faces. 600 reais a month. I mean, of course, we would very much like to do that, because we know that there are a lot of vulnerable people in Brazil, but we just can't do that on a permanent basis. It's not realistic. Unfortunately, it's not realistic.
I think this is the main question, the central question involving the Bolsonaro's future, because it all is going to depend on what he decides to do. But I don't see him doing anything different from that. He will find something to put in the place of emergency basic income. And I also don't think it's given that if he cuts this basic income, that he's going to lose support. It depends, because we know that all these supports and people, the way people think in the time of voting depends on the perception. So it's not only money. If people feel that they are better now than they were before, and the now is going to be in 2022 and 2022,
which is just around the corner as a matter of politics.
Yeah, we thought, lots of people thought that all these deaths and the way Bolsonaro was dealing with the crisis would harm him. And I think it's a hint. It's not. I'm not sure that, but it's a hint that I think that people have this judgment. People in peripheries, in slums, they don't have the condition of protecting themselves properly. They're not in the condition to simply go into a complete lockdown. So they think at least government gave something to me, did something for me. So I think this is what, in the end of the day, this is what works. So I don't think it's useful for us to say, oh, he's going to cut the basic income. Oh, this is terrible. He's going to be that tomorrow, because it's not the way that it works. And besides, we need to have a good opponent for him in 2022. Sorry, if he don't, forget about it. You know.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's going to have we're going to have impeachment or anything like that. We're in a stable situation, you know.
Yeah, I fully agree.
So let me actually so like this, we have 10 more minutes, so this will be kind of maybe the last round here. So I'll try to bring together actually questions from many of our viewers and actually things you ask each other. So as you guys talk to each other and kind of ask a question, I guess we'll start with Malu, which is, so in one way, like what Monica said is like, we look at this government and think this is a group of people who have absolutely no plan, right, to deal with the crisis, right? So and then we bring together a question from one of our viewers, Hugo, who makes a good point, which is Bolsonaro also has a weird relationship now, or a kind of more oscillating relationship with his own economy minister, right, Paulo Guedes, right, which was supposed to be, the go-to guy to all economics or economy questions, and now there's like a lot of conflict. So like with this, what do you think if there is any plan or there is anything we foresee in terms of economic policy coming out of this situation would be? And to some extent, and then I'll pull another question from one of our viewers, which is why we kind of don't see any good proposals coming out of the government. Brazil has like a kind of lively like civil society that's proposing things. There's like people in academia who are proposing things. There's people all over who are proposing things. Like say like the way Monica is proposing, a fiscally responsive way to continue having basic income, or other people are making proposals. What do you think is kind of the failure? Why doesn't these things kind of enter through the government and enter through the kind of make its way into actual discussions in Brasilia, in the capital? Yeah.
Two questions. Well, as for Paulo Guedes, you asked if they have a plan, right? I don't think they have a plan other than stay in power. So, and also Paulo Guedes, I know him I know him well, not very well, but I know him. I did a profile. I spent 3 months with him in the 2018, and what I can see and what I saw is that he wanted very badly to be a minister. So this is most important than anything, and I think he will do anything he needs to stay in the ministry. But depending on the situation, he might be thrown out, as other ministers Bolsonaro had already thrown out. And I don't think Bolsonaro has a plan, but he has this will. And I don't think, and what I can see from what is going on is that he's pressuring everyone he can to give him a plan to go through the end of his term. And it's not a negligible element that we have military in the budget board now in the Congress. So if you have, he put all the military in the budget board, he has a minister that is working on this basic income as something that is gonna take money and from other programs, and he's gonna put it up. And if Guedes gets in the way of this plan, he's going to kick Paulo Guedes out. Simply as that. What is the other question?
So actually, I mean, this is like actually this is for both of you. The other question. So it's from one of our viewers, which they say they're actually like Brazil has like a lively civil society, right? And
this is with Monica.
Which is making this all sorts of proposals, right? And the question is, why is, I guess there's a failure of these proposals to coming into the actual political process, the process that happens in Brasilia, that happens in Congress and with the president, which is either a failure of, the the current government, Bolsonaro and his ministers, to pick them up, or it's a failure of having an organized opposition who say, hey, like, why won't we do this, right? Why don't we go this way or that way, right? And so the question
is, good they take the proposition, the basic income proposition. They took it out. They took for them.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a little bit, do you think that the failure here really is that, you have this government who's is really just shutting down any more sensible proposals that come kind of from the ground up, and just trying to, kind of really survive day by day and do this kind of populist.
Well, I think the challenge really, and I don't think we have. So first of all, let me echo something that Malu has already said. We do not have an organized opposition in Brazil at all. Okay, we have political parties in the opposition, some of which are engaged in finding proposals and trying to, find ways out of the crises. And we have other political parties that, are really more interested in thinking about where they'll be in 2022. And that creates a problem because this whole discussion that was going on in Brazil about the need for a united front on the part of the opposition hasn't happened. It really hasn't happened. And it likely won't, because we're in the middle of a pandemic and now things are in chaos. So if it didn't happen before, it's unlikely to happen now. And on top of that, we have this other difficulty, which I think Malu spoke to very well, which is whatever proposal actually does come out. So, if we start to discuss different modalities for a basic income program, well, the government is going to jump in and is going to say, as they have with the Renda Brasil program, which doesn't really have a lot of content to it yet, doesn't have a lot of substance, but it has the idea. It will come in and it'll say, no, we have a better idea. And, it's a basic income program, but it's a much better idea. And, we're going to go ahead and do it this way. And that leaves the opposition, or that has left a lot of people in the opposition with either the impetus to attack the government on the basis of, they're going to be spending more than they should, and the opposition in Brazil is loath to do that, so they won't do it. Or it leaves them in this situation where what do we say now kind of situation. Nobody is really thinking through and saying, okay, so fine, so the government wants to do this Renda Brasil program, so let's look at is there substance? Where's the substance? Nobody's actually asking the government, because there's no unified opposition. Nobody's actually facing off with the government and trying to ask the difficult questions. And that leaves this really wide space, or this very wide space of operation under which the government can basically flip-flop all over the place without having anything concrete and still winning the narrative, because after all, they are also in support of a basic income program. So that is really the bottom line of the kind of situation that we're in. And what's sad about it is that it is a huge missed opportunity, because there is a lot that could be discussed and a lot that could be done if only a lot of these different moving parts in the opposition could agree that it is more important to do things for the country right now than to think about what happens in 2022. But obviously that's asking too much of politicians, because that's just not how they think, especially politicians in Brazil. So unfortunately, a lot of these efforts, and some of us are very involved in that. I'm really involved in this basic income effort in Congress. There's a whole advisory council that I'm on, and we're there. We're analyzing proposals, and we're trying to help Congress members in devising, what the best program would be, given the conditions that the country has, this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, I sort of fear that it's futile. It's futile, because the government will jump in with their Renda Brasil and they'll win the day. That is what's going to happen, unless things completely change, and they likely won't.
It's a very optimistic life,
Very optimistic.
Yeah. Future. It's kind of it's illuminating, you see?
Yeah, so I was about to chime in to say that like we're actually kind of hitting our time limit that we kind of set here. So yeah, so maybe I could do the very unfair thing to Malu and say, well, you could close up with some like optimistic remarks here, but I think you already done it. So, but if any of you have
Malu is wearing green. Malu is wearing green
Yes.
for hope. So we can end on that note.
I'm a very optimistic person, but I'm a skeptic. I don't know, skeptic. I'm a skeptic. So,
so
that's difficult.
So if any of you guys have like a short closing thing you would like to say, on maybe how we, Okay.
I don't know what to say.
Yes. So yeah, we'll try to close on the more optimistic tone here, which is
well. Let's do this. Why don't we try next time? Because there will be a next time. We will strive to bring better news, and hopefully we will be talking about more constructive issues. But right now it's really it's just what's happening. I mean, what can we do? We're not saying anything I think that people are not already seeing. It's what we can say.
Yes.
We have to count on the element surprise element, imponderable.
The imponderable.
That happens.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So this is exactly. So you actually gave me the optimistic kind of ending here. Yeah. So So first of all, of course, to thank you both for coming here. It was like fantastic. I hope our viewers enjoyed. It was all great. I really like the way you both ended this, saying like it is maybe we cannot be optimistic, but that's what it is, and that's
we have to be smart. Only
yes.
That's enough.
Yes, if we're about to talk about the Brazilian situation today, that's the tone to be talking about it. So I'd like to thank again, Malu and Monica, who were fantastic here. And I'd like to also thank all the viewers, who are watching us at home. I've actually been looking at all the questions you sent. They're all great. Some of you, I couldn't bring most of them up here, but actually looking at what the topics there were, a lot of them were actually questions that Monica and Malu actually answered throughout the organically as they talked, which I think kind of speaks to how everybody's kind of thinking about the same topics and kind of worried about the same issues, right? So I'd just like to kind of finish here and thank Monica and Malu once again.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Thomas. Bye, Monica.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malu.
Bye.
Bye.